Imagine you're climbing a snow-covered mountain. The temperature is around -20 degrees Fahrenheit and getting colder by the second. The air up here is thin, so oxygen is a luxury. Breathing is a struggle, and the harsh reflection of the sun on the white snow is literally blinding you. Your legs ache from the climb you've endured so far, and your mind aches from the climb that is still ahead. Each step you take sinks knee-deep, making it harder to put one foot in front of another. Will you make it to the top, or will you collapse in the deadly comfort of the snow? Oh, and don't forget, you voluntarily paid tens of thousands of dollars to be here, wanting to claim the prize of conquering the mountain that's taken more lives than Mount Everest. This is the ascent of one of the deadliest mountains in the world, K2. It's nicknamed Savage Mountain for good reason. To get here, you've been saving up for expensive equipment, not to mention an experienced guide who actually knows how to get you to the top alive and back down again. However, the cost is the last thing on your mind right now, as you're well past the death zone and heading to the deadliest landmark on the trek. This is known as the bottleneck, and many have passed away at this exact point, including some of the climbers on this list. The bottleneck sits at an elevation of 26,400 feet, meaning you still have approximately 1,800 feet to go to the 28,251-foot summit. What makes it so deadly? Come find out as we journey up the Savage Mountain. If you don't know about K2, it's the second highest peak in the world, beaten only by the mighty Everest. However, K2 is actually considered more deadly than its big brother, and mountaineers regard it as far more challenging. Everest holds an average of 6.5 deaths per 100 successful summits, while K2 has 14 deaths per 100 summits. It owes this to unpredictable weather, constant rock falls, and difficult climbing sections, not to mention the infamous bottleneck zone. An estimated 700 people have reached the peak, with the mountain claiming the lives of 96 brave climbers. In harsh climbs like this, there's an unspoken rule. No matter what happens, you only save yourself. If you take a look at some of the websites offering guidance up K2, some of the prices will leave you dumbfounded. For a standard package, you're looking at a cost of $35,000, which includes the necessary supplies like high-altitude food, fuel, and tents, plus 3 bottles of life-saving oxygen for you and 1 to 2 bottles for the Sherpa, who will help you lug all your equipment to the top. If you have a bit more money to spend and want to up your chances of reaching the top, you can go for bigger packages that cost upwards of $50,000. This will net you 10 bottles of oxygen and 2 Sherpas, on top of everything else. Remember, these prices don't include the pricey gear required for the journey. You'll need a specialized thermal suit, gloves, GPS trackers, crampons, goggles, and some two-way radios just in case. This will cost you between $5,000 and $10,000, depending on the quality of the equipment you get. However, no matter how much money you spend, your survival is not guaranteed. If you happen to die near the summit, chances are your body will be trapped in a frozen grave forever and never make it back down for a proper burial. A rescue operation, or worse, a body recovery, is far too risky and often results in the deaths of more people. Up in the ice-cold wild of the mountains, it is truly survival of the fittest. And this is exactly what was caught on camera in the case of Mohammed Hassan, a porter who was stuck in a horrible situation right in the bottleneck, the harshest part of the K2 summit. His death on the 27th of July, 2023, sparked controversy throughout the climbing world and marked a turning point for how people handle these situations. Mohammed was a porter who worked for Leela Peak Expeditions, a company based in Pakistan that specializes in tours in the Karakoram Range, where the K2 is situated. Now, to answer the previous question of what makes the bottleneck so dangerous, on any mountain when you hit the 26,000 mark, you enter a region known as the death zone. Above this point, the air becomes too thin to breathe, and your lungs have to work overtime to deliver oxygen into your bloodstream. Severe altitude sickness starts to set in, and if you don't get the oxygen you need, you will collapse from sheer exhaustion. The bottleneck of K2 lies at 26,400 feet, so at this point, your body will still be acclimatizing to the harshest part of your journey up the mountain. To make matters worse, this section is characterized by a steep gully with ice glaciers hanging above. This means it's prone to avalanches and falling ice that can turn a tough situation fatal. On this day, it would prove to be especially deadly. At roughly 2:30 a.m., a long line of climbers were trudging through the bottleneck. They were in the final stretch, so many were trying to push themselves in the hopes of breaking a record. And if they didn't make it to the summit that day, they would have to pack up and go home, since the expeditions wrapped up at the end of the month. Mohammed Hassan, working for Lila Peak Expeditions, was tasked with setting guide ropes to ensure the safety of all those making the journey. Tragedy struck when an avalanche hit the side of the mountain, drenching many climbers in a blanket of snow and causing Mohammed to fall. He'd also broken his oxygen mask in the fall, right in the zone where oxygen is essential for your survival. A climber that witnessed the event, Ali Pepper, said they managed to pull him back up. At first, he was alive, but he couldn't be saved. Then everyone had to step over him to head towards the summit. To respect this horrific situation and honor Mohammed, I've blurred out his image, but in the clip recorded of the event, you can see Mohammed laying on the path, begging other climbers for help, unable to move from the effects of hypothermia and oxygen deprivation setting in. Yet, no one stopped, as many climbers were focused on breaking a record to reach the summit. According to drone footage, Mohammed was still moving for 3 hours, hoping someone would be able to help. The help he needed never came. Before his accident, Sherpas that were part of the rope-fixing team told him to go back many times, as his climbing equipment and clothes were not adequate for the freezing temperatures. But he refused and followed the other climbers. Sherpas and porters risk their lives to enable their rich clients to summit mountains like K2 and Everest, but they're not paid nearly what they're worth. Apparently, Lila Peak Expeditions paid Mohammed 250,000 Pakistani rupees, or $896, to sort himself out with equipment. It's likely he saved all this money for his family instead of buying the necessary gear. He left behind his family of 3 young children. Over 50 climbers stepped over him and did not start a rescue attempt, even though he was still alive and pleading for assistance. In these situations, it's almost impossible to help. Yet, if you were here, what would you have done? Jan Frederick Erikson was a Swedish mountaineer and extreme skier who had tons of mountain climbing experience and alpine knowledge, but sometimes knowledge isn't enough protection against the shadow of the mountains. Erikson grew up in the northern Swedish city of Umeå, but he spent a lot of his time in the French Alps, in the town of Chamonix. In the summer of 2003, he climbed and skied down Ismoil Somoni Peak in Tajikistan, which stands at a massive 24,590 feet tall. The next year, in 2004, he became the first Swede to ski all the way down from the central summit of the 26,335-foot Shisha Pangma in Tibet. Skiing down an 8,000-meter mountain takes nerves of steel, but Erikson wanted to push the envelope in everything he did, and skiing was his passion. In 2005, Erikson and his Norwegian buddy, Jorgen Amet, tried to ski the legendary Lila Peak in Pakistan, which tops out at 19,912 feet. However, harsh conditions forced them to turn around just a couple hundred feet short of the peak. Still, they were the first people to ever ski down that mountain. Later that same year, they knocked off skiing from the summit of the 26,362-foot Gasherbrum II. This was Erikson's second ski down an 8,000er. He returned to the Himalayas in 2007 to try for his third 8,000er, the Dhaulagiri in Nepal, but the snow was too deep and too dangerous, forcing him to turn around. Even still, he skied a crazy vertical of 914 feet back down to base camp. Erikson's skis took him around the world to places like Turkey, Iceland, Sicily, and Svalbard. His adventures were featured in documentary films like Skiing Everest and ski movies such as Free Radicals 618 and Kong Winter 3. Now remember, to ski down these insane slopes, Erikson first had to climb up with all his skiing equipment too. In 2009, something terrible happened that would foreshadow his own death just a year later. Erikson and his friend Michel Fate were attempting an extremely difficult first ski descent of the K2 along the Sesson route. After spending a night at Camp 2, the pair began their extreme ski down the Savage Mountain. All was going according to plan when, at roughly 21,000 feet, Michel Fate's skis slipped on a sheet of ice and then collided with rocks, catapulting him over the base of the mountain wall. Erikson watched as his friend plummeted over the 3,280-foot drop, leaving no chance of survival. Regardless, Erikson never stopped dreaming about this descent project, and after this incident with his friend and skiing partner, he simply could not abandon his dream of skiing down the K2. Was he ignoring signs from the universe to give up on his dream? On the morning of the 6th of August 2010, Gerlinde Kaltenbrunner joined Erikson and his partner Trey Cook, all determined to summit and become the first to ski down the infamous K2. All week, climbers had dodged bowling ball-sized rocks displaced by snowmelt that careened down the mountain. By the time the climbers reached Camp 4, they were sleeping with their helmets on, but Erikson was determined. The group left Camp 4 near the 26,246 feet mark at 1:30 a.m. There was light snow, 300-foot visibility, blustering winds, and bone-chilling temps of 5 degrees Fahrenheit. Fortunately, the weather was forecast to improve throughout the day, so they pressed on. Between 6:30 and 7 a.m., just below the notorious bottleneck, Cook had to turn back, his hands still recovering from frostbite sustained while establishing their camp 3 weeks earlier. Undeterred, Erikson and the Austrian Kaltenbrunner continued upwards through the bottleneck. Once at the bottleneck, Erikson had to place a piton, a peg that's driven into an ice surface for support. But right at this moment, yet another rock became dislodged from the snowmelt and came careening towards him. And unfortunately, this was not one he could avoid. The rock impacted him with force, knocking him completely off the mountain. In a sickening instant, he plummeted 1,000 meters to his death as Kaltenbrunner watched in horror. She did not complete the ascent and turned back immediately. Once at base camp with her husband Ralph, the Kaltenbrunners could do nothing but recount those tragic final moments high on K2. Jan Frederick Erikson could not let go of his dream, so much so that when he fell at the start of the K2's bottleneck, he still had his skis strapped to his rucksack. Tadeusz Petroski is another climber who witnessed the passing of 2 of his climbing partners, but still continued despite this until he shared a similar fate. The route responsible for his passing is so dangerous that only one other team has ever attempted to repeat it. His story began in the 1960s, when a young Petroski set foot in Poland's Tatra Mountains. His passion for mountaineering ignited while studying at the Szczecin University of Technology. Little did he know then that his passion would lead him to become one of Poland's most celebrated mountaineers, renowned globally as a winter climbing specialist. He was a pioneer in the world of mountaineering, so on many of his climbs, he was the first to attempt the route. Some of his notable winter climbs include Trollryggen in Norway, Noshak in Afghanistan, Tirikmir in Pakistan, Rakaposhi in Pakistan, Distagilsar in Pakistan, and Api in Nepal. He even successfully summited the mountain that would take his life, K2, during the summer of 1986. It's clear that Petroski was a seasoned pro, but the Savage Mountain doesn't care about where you come from or how life has hardened you. His first encounter with death came in 1974. Petroski and his climbing partner Stanislaw Latalo were attempting to summit the 4th highest mountain on Earth, Lhotse, based in Nepal. Stanislaw was a cinematographer and cameraman. On the 17th of December, 1974, Stanislaw accompanied the Polish Himalayan expedition, including Petroski, to document the event. He joined the expedition despite not having much mountaineering experience. This lack of experience was likely the cause behind his passing. As the team was descending from Camp 3, Stanislaw suffered a fatal fall into a crevasse of the Khumbu Glacier. He was only 29 years old. His body could not be recovered, so he was forever immortalized in the depths of the Lhotse mountain. Petroski's next brush with fate came in 1983 when he was directing the winter ascent of Api in the Himalayas. He was accompanied by his climbing partner Andrzej Bielun. The pair summited the mountain, but they became split up. The exact details of his demise are unclear, but it appears Andrzej became lost. He was never found and assumed dead near the top of the mountain. These 2 deaths were not enough to stop Petroski's pioneering nature, and unfortunately, His own death came on the 10th of July, 1986. 2 days prior, Petroski and his climbing partner, Jerzy Kukuczka, completed the first ascent of the south face of K2, otherwise known as the Polish Line. It's an extremely difficult route, holding the dangers of avalanches and seracs, which are glacial ice columns that can give way at any moment. Reinhold Messner, an Italian who was the first to do a solo ascent of Everest and the first to ascend without supplemental oxygen, said this route was suicidal. It was during the descent of this climb that tragedy struck Petroski. After 2 exhausting stops with no food or water, the pair continued making their way down the Abruzzi Spur. According to reports, Petroski lost his crampons, a vital piece of equipment for traversing these frozen wastelands. At around 25,900 feet, he suddenly lost his footing in the icy terrain and fell to his death. To make this story even more tragic, on October 24, 1989, his climbing partner that day, Kukuczka, also lost his life while trying to scale the unclimbed south face of Lhotse in Nepal. The second-hand rope he was using, purchased from a second-hand market, failed as he fell and plunged 6,560 feet. His body was never recovered. The next 3 stories include a fatal turn of events that resulted in the demise of more than one person. Next up, we have Juan Pablo Moore, John Snorri Sigurjonsson, and Muhammad Ali Sadpara. All of them were high-achieving mountaineers with a long list of accomplishments under their names. In 2017, Juan Moore was one of the first Chileans to summit Annapurna, the 10th highest peak in the Himalayas, standing at an altitude of 26,545 feet. In 2019, Juan was registered in the Guinness Records for being the first person to summit Lhotse and Everest without having to return to base camp in less than a week, without Sherpas or supplemental oxygen. He also had a brush with death in his own year of passing. On January 17, 2021, Juan and fellow climber Sergei Mingotti were descending K2 in winter without the use of oxygen when Sergei suffered a huge fall. He passed shortly after being reached by a medical team and other climbers. Juan wasn't the only one who looked death in the face before his own demise. John Sigurjonsson from Iceland was the first Icelander to summit K2 and Lhotse. He also summited another 8,000er known as Broad Peak in Pakistan, the 12th highest mountain in the world. In January of 2021, a Russian-American climber went missing during a training climb on Pastor Peak. John assisted with the search and rescue operations, delaying his plans to climb K2 with partners Juan and Ali Sadpara in the climb that would take their lives. Isn't it strange how both John and Juan were in the vicinity of death just a few days before their own? Ali Sadpara is the next skilled mountaineer that was part of this crew. In 2016, the climber from Pakistan was part of a team that made history with the first winter ascent of Nanga Parbat. By the end of his career, Sadpara had conquered 8 8,000ers, an impressive feat made even more astounding by his successful climbs of 4 of these towering peaks within a single calendar year. In February of 2021, Sadpara, alongside his 21-year-old son Sajid, teamed up with John Sigurjonsson and Juan Pablo Moore for a winter ascent of K2. Sajid had summited K2 in 2019, so he was no stranger to the harsh environment. On the evening of the 4th of February 2021, the team left the highest camp to start the last journey up a mountain they would ever take. When the team got near the bottleneck portion of K2, Sajid suffered from equipment failure that likely saved his life. His oxygen regulator malfunctioned, so he was forced to descend back to camp. Juan, Sadpara, and John continued on their perilous path. On the evening of the 5th of February, the team had not returned from their ascent as they should have, and they were reported missing. It is unclear exactly what happened and whether they reached the summit, but what could be gathered is that they were descending the mountain when they could no longer continue. 2 Pakistan Army helicopters were mobilized to assist in search and rescue, but they had no luck finding anyone, dead or alive. It was only 5 months later that their bodies were discovered by a Madison Mountaineering Sherpa team that was fixing ropes above the camp. From what the team could gather, Juan had descended below the bottleneck and was waiting for the others, but they never arrived. John, meanwhile, had been caught in his own guide rope, likely not realizing this, while struggling down the mountain. Sadpara's body was found not far from him. It seems these skilled mountaineers all fell prey to the harsh cold of a K2 winter and simply could not move anymore from utter exhaustion. Sadpara's son, Sajid, recovered the 3 bodies and gave these brave men the burials they deserved. There are many cases like this where extreme fatigue overcomes those who can normally push themselves beyond the limits of their bodies. Dudley Wolf was one of these people, and his exhaustion led to his death and the demise of 3 others. He was an American socialite born in the late 1890s. At the time of his passing, none of the 14 mountains higher than 26,000 feet had been summited. So this was a pioneering attempt to achieve the seemingly impossible goal of getting to the peak of K2. At a party organized by Wolf, he was approached by Fritz Weissner with an insane proposition. The German-American climber had the goal of reaching the K2 summit, and he was looking for wealthy mountaineers who could help cover the costs of such a journey. Wolf was immediately hooked on the idea, despite his inexperience in climbing high mountains. So the pair gathered a team and set sail for the Savage Mountain on the 1939 American Karakoram expedition to K2. Once they reached the mountain, Wolf was dismayed that Weissner had not brought 2-way radios, but the team continued regardless. They all started off strong, but Wolf began to draw criticism from the other climbers as he was noticeably slower. However, Weissner favored Wolf, as he did not complain and maintained his endurance. Wolf got further up the mountain than any of the other American climbers. No one had bottled oxygen, and by Camp 8 at 25,300 feet, Wolf could get no higher. Weissner and Pasang Dawa Lama, a man regarded as the greatest Sherpa mountaineer of the 20th century, decided to continue for the summit and return for Wolf. Wolf waited for an insane 7 days in the blistering cold for the pair to return. Unfortunately, they did not reach the summit. Weissner and Pasang went back to Wolf and descended down to Camp 7. However, Wolf could no longer push himself. The 7 days of waiting for his group had taken a massive toll on him. His companions descended to each camp, looking for equipment or someone to aid in a rescue, yet everything had been removed. Eventually, they arrived at base camp. Wolf waited another 7 days in terrible conditions. The fact that he survived this long is a testament to unbelievable endurance. On July 29th, 3 Sherpas attempted a rescue. They reached Wolf, but he was in a delirious mental state from the effects of hypothermia. He refused to go down and asked that they return the next day. A couple days later, the 3 Sherpas attempted another rescue. However, they got caught in the fatal embrace of the K2 mountain on their ascent, never being seen again. By this point in the journey, Wolf had spent 38 days above 22,000 feet and 16 days without supplemental oxygen. It's estimated that he passed on the 30th of July, 1939. It was only in 2002 that any trace of Dudley Wolf was found. On the Godwin-Austen Glacier at the foot of K2, skeletal remains were discovered along with vintage pieces of mountaineering equipment, a leather mitten marked Wolf, and an ancient dinner plate. Using the dinner plate, a plaque was made at the nearby Gilkey Memorial, which had the names of 52 other climbers by this point. Sometimes people are not prepared for the harrowing journey up K2, but sometimes there's a twisted turn of events that just keeps getting worse as everything unfolds. This is what happened during the 2008 K2 disaster, where 11 climbers lost their lives and 3 others were seriously injured. The dreadful sequence of events went down as the worst disaster in K2's history. Many details of what went wrong were lost with the climbers, but the story has been pieced together over time. The best time to scale K2 is between June and August. However, in July of 2008, harsh weather conditions prohibited any group from attempting a summit of the Savage Mountain. As the end of July was approaching, 10 teams were eagerly waiting for Mother Nature to calm her fury. Finally, on the 1st of August, weather conditions had let up, and teams of people gathered at Camp 4 to begin the ascent. This included mountaineering groups hailing from France, Ireland, South Korea, Nepal, Norway, Pakistan, and Serbia, as well as a group of their respective Sherpas. They all agreed to cooperate in what would be a harsh ascent. Complications began when an experienced high-altitude porter, Shaheen Baig, started to suffer from debilitating symptoms of altitude sickness. He returned to camp, but the other porters and Sherpas felt disordered, with the most skilled of them now gone. Crucial ropes seemed to have been forgotten, and some had been placed too low down the slope, so the teams ended up running out of rope just above the death zone of the K2, right at the bottleneck. This resulted in unforeseen holdups. Then, the first death of many occurred. During the treacherous journey through the bottleneck, Serbian climber Dren Mandic attempted to pass Norwegian mountaineer Cecil Skog. In doing so, he detached from the fixed rope while adjusting his oxygen brace. Tragically, Mandic lost his balance, causing a collision with Skog. While Skog remained securely tethered, Mandic plummeted over 330 feet down the unforgiving bottleneck. Some of the team members descended to aid in the recovery of Mandic, but another high-altitude porter, Johan Baig, was suffering from altitude sickness. He fell during the attempted recovery of Mandic and failed to perform a self-arrest maneuver, leading to another fatal fall that cost him his life. Regardless, the rest of the teams at the bottleneck continued their ascent to the summit. Many climbers had reached the summit, and it was now 8:30 in the evening, with darkness descending over K2. Suddenly, an immense glacial ice formation broke loose from above the bottleneck. As it careened down the mountain, the serac sliced through the safety lines, tragically sweeping away climber Rolf Bay. The aftermath of the serac collapse and the resulting avalanche claimed 4 more lives, with significant challenges left for those navigating the bottleneck. Littered with ice debris, climbers found themselves stranded in the treacherous death zone above 26,250 feet as darkness consumed them. With no supplementary ropes or fall protection gear to replace the severed lines, many climbers were forced to attempt a free solo descent, relying solely on their skills and experience. Panic spread among the climbers caught on the high ridge, with some risking the perilous night descent, while others opted to build shelters, postponing their journey until daylight offered a safer path. For many of the mountaineers, descending would prove to be a fatal mistake. It is unclear what occurred in the darkness of their descent, but it seems more climbers lost their footing and fell to their demise. Rescue attempts began in the early hours of August 2nd, but by then, most of the damage had already been done. Many of the bodies were not even recovered for a proper burial. As the full extent of the tragedy unfolded, the heartbreaking news revealed that 11 lives had been lost. The devastating impact of nature's unforgiving power will forever be memorialized within the haunting legacy of the 2008 K2 disaster. Thanks for watching. Let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.